Ernest Borgnine spent more than 6 decades in show business playing tough guys, lovable oafs, war heroes, and eventually a cartoon superhero shrimp for a new generation of kids who had no idea he'd once won an Academy Award. Along the way, he worked with some of the biggest and most volatile personalities Hollywood ever produced. He weathered an intimidating co-star who reduced him to fumbling his lines, watched 2 actresses come to actual blows on a desert film set, and endured a leading lady who rewrote her own dialogue on a whim. But out of everyone who ever tested his patience, there was one name Borgnine could never quite let go of, one relationship so short and so painful that decades later he was still talking about it with a wince. Before we get to that, though, it helps to understand just how unlikely it was that Ernest Borgnine became a star in the first place. Borgnine was born in a small Connecticut town, the son of Italian immigrants trying to make a life in a new country. Stability didn't come easily. When he was still a small child, his parents separated, and his mother took him back across the Atlantic to Italy, where he spent several formative years, growing up almost entirely immersed in Italian language and culture, with barely a memory of the country he'd technically been born in. Then, just as suddenly, his parents reconciled, and the family returned to the United States, where his father anglicized the family's name in an effort to blend into American life more easily. For a boy who had already been uprooted once, it was another identity shift to absorb, and it wouldn't be the last transformation that shaped him. Growing up in New Haven, there was nothing about young Borgnine that suggested a future in show business. He was a sports kid, drawn to physical competition rather than the stage, and nobody around him, least of all himself, imagined he'd ever end up in front of a camera. What actually set his life in motion was the United States Navy. He enlisted right out of high school in the mid and spent years aboard a destroyer, eventually earning an honorable discharge just before the country was pulled into the Second World War. Like a lot of veterans of that era, watching Pearl Harbor happen from the sidelines wasn't an option, and he re-enlisted almost immediately, serving aboard a patrol vessel tasked with defending the Atlantic coast for the remainder of the war. Those years at sea did more than fill his resume. They hardened him, taught him discipline, and gave him a first-hand understanding of camaraderie under pressure that would later inform every military character he ever played on screen. By the time he was discharged for good, he'd risen to a respectable enlisted rank, earned several honors along the way, and had genuinely considered making the Navy his lifelong career, seriously weighing whether to sign on for another decade of service. If his mother hadn't pulled him aside one day and told him, almost offhandedly, that he had a strong enough personality to try acting, there's a real chance Hollywood would never have heard his name at all. It's a strange thing to think about now, given how thoroughly his face and voice would eventually become part of American popular culture, that the whole thing hinged on one passing comment from his mother rather than any burning ambition of his own. At the time, the idea struck him as almost absurd. He had no formal training, no industry contacts, and no clear sense of how a person even became an actor. What he did have was the same stubborn discipline the Navy had drilled into him, and he applied it the same way he'd applied himself to shipboard duties, showing up, doing the unglamorous work, and refusing to quit even when nothing about the path forward was obvious. Acting wasn't a natural transition. Borgnine had no training, no contacts, and no real understanding of the industry he was walking into. He enrolled in a small drama school in Hartford, and then made his way to a regional theater in Virginia that had a genuinely strange origin story. Founded during the Great Depression, it allowed audience members to pay for tickets with food instead of cash, which meant actors were sometimes literally paid in vegetables. Borgnine didn't care. He took every role he could get, and when he wasn't performing, he was painting sets, mending costumes, or cleaning the building. He learned to think on his feet the hard way too, including one infamous night when a live chicken he was supposed to wrangle on stage escaped into the audience mid-performance, sending the crowd into a mix of screaming and laughter that he somehow had to work with in real time. His break came when he landed a part in a Tennessee Williams production that he was privately convinced he'd bombed. Audiences disagreed, and word started to spread. By the late he'd made it to Broadway, appearing in a long-running production alongside one of the biggest movie stars of the era. Getting there hadn't been simple. Casting directors genuinely didn't know what to do with his face. Too intimidating for straightforward comedy. Too oddly expressive for pure menace. That Broadway role finally gave him a place to belong, and he used the opportunity to study his famous co-star obsessively, reportedly keeping a private notebook of observations about line delivery and stage presence that he'd study like a student cramming for an exam. The show ran for well over 1,000 performances, finally giving him some financial footing. Television came calling next, first through a low-budget science fiction serial where he played a villain, and then through a small film role that put him on Columbia Pictures' radar. His real breakout arrived when he was cast as a sadistic, brutal army sergeant in a major war drama, a role that required him to beat a beloved co-star's character to death in one of the most disturbing scenes filmed in Hollywood up to that point. He committed to the darkness of that character so completely that his own co-stars kept their distance from him for weeks after filming wrapped, and some audience members reportedly couldn't separate the actor from the monster he'd played, sending him hate mail as if he'd actually committed the crime on screen. It was unsettling, but it also made him impossible to ignore. 2 years later came the role that changed everything. He played an unassuming, lonely butcher looking for companionship in a tiny, low-budget drama that nobody expected to succeed. The production had almost no money behind it by studio standards of the day, and plenty of people in the industry assumed it would come and go without much notice. Instead, it became a critical and commercial phenomenon, connecting with audiences in a way none of the studio executives had anticipated. Borgnine, well into his 30s, walked away with the Academy Award for Best Actor, making him one of the older performers to ever win for a first major leading role, and in the process he beat out some of the most celebrated young talents of his generation. He almost didn't get the part at all. The director had originally wanted someone else entirely, an actor who'd already played the role in an earlier television version of the story, and Borgnine wasn't even seriously in consideration until a chance meeting at a Hollywood party changed the director's mind enough to offer him a screen test. Once the cameras rolled, there was no more doubt. The film's director later said Borgnine hadn't performed the role so much as simply become the character, and that natural, unforced quality was exactly what audiences responded to. At the ceremony, his acceptance speech was short and unpretentious. He simply thanked a mother whose passing suggestion had put him on this path in the first place. That one reshaped more than his own career. It became something of a case study in the industry, proof that a film didn't need major stars or a sprawling budget to win over both critics and mainstream audiences, a lesson that would echo through independent filmmaking for decades afterward. What followed was one of the more unpredictable careers in Hollywood history. He played a hardened military commander in a blockbuster war film in the late, insisting on doing his own stunts well into his 50s. He turned around and played a ruthless outlaw in one of the most violent and influential westerns ever made, delivering a performance so unsettling in its intensity that certain moments reportedly stuck with him personally for years afterward. His path to television stardom was just as winding. He turned down the lead in a hit sitcom right after winning his Oscar, publicly dismissing television as a passing fad that serious actors shouldn't bother with. He came to regret that dismissiveness almost immediately after a chance encounter with a seriously ill child at a charity event, who told him how much comfort his films had brought during hospital stays. That conversation reportedly changed his entire outlook on a medium, and when a Navy comedy series came his way not long after, he jumped at it. The show became a genuine hit and made him a household name in a completely different register than his film work, playing a laid-back officer leading a crew of lovable misfits, a role shaped in no small part by his own years of actual Navy service. He later admitted publicly that he'd been wrong to look down on television, saying that what mattered wasn't the size of the screen, but the size of the audience it reached. Even into his 60s and 70s, he kept surprising people. He took on an action series that had him doing dangerous helicopter stunts well past retirement age, an approach that very nearly got him killed during one accident on set. And in the final chapter of his career, an entirely new generation discovered him through a children's cartoon, where he voiced a retired superhero shrimp who becomes a minor recurring character's idol. He landed that role almost by accident, too, delivering an impromptu reading off a napkin at a charity event after his grandson had spent months insisting he needed to be on the show. He kept recording for that series until just weeks before he died at the age of 95, making him one of the oldest working voice actors in the business at the time. Along the way, Borgnine crossed paths with some genuinely difficult personalities, and he wasn't shy about acknowledging it later in interviews. Working opposite one veteran leading man on a tense western in the mid left him rattled for the entire shoot. The older, far more established actor had a habit of improvising lines on the spot and keeping his less experienced co-stars off balance, and Borgnine, still relatively new to film, found himself fumbling scenes under the pressure. During one crucial fight sequence, filmed without stunt doubles, he accidentally landed a genuinely hard punch, and the tension between the two men was thick enough that the entire set went quiet. Ironically, that same demanding co-star ended up recommending him for the role that would win him his Oscar not long after. Proof that respect in Hollywood often arrives in strange packaging. He also found himself in the middle of one of the more explosive on-set feuds of the era, while filming a western in the Arizona desert in the mid. Two of his female co-stars despised each other so intensely that they refused to appear in the same room together, forcing the director to shoot their scenes separately and stitch the footage together in editing. Borgnine watched one of them throw a rival's wardrobe out onto the highway in a fit of rage, and later witnessed the two actresses nearly come to physical blows on set, a moment chaotic enough that he and another co-star had to physically separate them. He personally got along fine with the more combustible of the two women, who even surprised the crew with a thoughtful parting gift on the last day of filming, but he never forgot witnessing her scald a young production assistant with a cup of hot coffee after a bad take, leaving the young man with serious burns. Working with her, he said years later, felt like walking on eggshells while juggling dynamite. Then there was the disaster film shoot in the early, where he played opposite a fiercely committed actress, known for showing up with pages of unsolicited character backstory and pushing hard for script changes the writers hadn't approved. Their working relationship was tense enough that he later called it one of the most exhausting stretches of his career, especially during a grueling underwater sequence that had to be res-hot dozens of times because she insisted on performing her own stunts despite safety concerns. Even so, he came away from that experience with genuine respect for her instincts, admitting afterward that her stubbornness, infuriating as it was in the moment, usually turned out to be right. None of those clashes, though, compared to the wound left by a much shorter, far more personal chapter of his life, his marriage to one of Broadway's biggest stars. They met and married in the summer of, and for a brief moment it looked like the kind of pairing tabloids dream about, two larger-than-life entertainers joining forces. They set off on a honeymoon to Japan, expecting romance. What they got instead was a slow-motion collapse. Crowds of fans followed Borgnine everywhere they went, and his new wife, an entertainer who was famously used to commanding every room she entered, found herself uncomfortably sidelined on her own honeymoon. The tension built with every stop on the trip, and by the time they reached Tokyo, witnesses later described hearing furious arguments echoing through their hotel. In a moment of pure frustration, she reportedly hurled an expensive ring into a hotel koi pond. The marriage was over within about a month, one of the shortest unions in Hollywood history, and she filed for divorce almost immediately after they returned home. What made the whole episode sting for years afterward wasn't the argument or even the divorce itself. It was what came after. She never spoke publicly about the marriage again, not in a single interview, for the rest of her life. When she published her memoir more than a decade later, she included a chapter with his name in the title. Readers who turned to that page expecting some kind of explanation, an apology, an accusation, anything, found it completely blank. Not a single word. It was a statement made entirely out of silence, and it landed harder than any insult could have. Borgnine admitted years afterward just how deeply that blank page affected him, describing it as something that hurt more than anything she could have actually written, a slight he said he never fully shook off. Of all the difficult, demanding, combustible people he worked and lived alongside over the course of his career, that brief marriage and its wordless final chapter seemed to be the one grievance time never quite softened. It's worth noting that the rest of Borgnine's romantic life was far from smooth either. His first marriage, to a woman he'd been with before fame ever entered the picture, produced his only child, but couldn't survive the pressures of his rising career and ended after nearly a decade. His next marriage, to a fiery Mexican actress, was defined by headline-making public arguments and lasted only a few years. After the disaster with the Broadway star, he married again in the mid-dash, this time to a woman with whom he had 3 children, a relationship that held together longer than his previous attempts, but still eventually ended in divorce by the early. It wasn't until when he met a Norwegian businesswoman at a party in Las Vegas that he finally found something lasting. She'd heard about his reputation and was hesitant at first, but he won her over, and they married the following year. That marriage held for nearly 4 decades, far longer than all of his previous relationships combined, and by every account it gave him a genuine partnership rather than a performance. She built her own successful business, and he became one of her most enthusiastic supporters, even joking publicly about being the world's oldest honorary spokesperson for her beauty line. In his final years, Borgnine credited her directly with keeping him going, saying in one of his last interviews that at 95 years old, still working and still full of energy, the reason was simply the love he had for her. When he passed away in the summer of, it was with her at his side, holding his hand, looking back across the whole arc of his life, from a rootless immigrant childhood split between 2 countries, through a decade at sea, into a Hollywood career built on reinvention after reinvention. Ernest Borgnine comes across as a man who generally handled conflict, criticism, and difficult co-stars with a kind of weathered good humor. He respected the actresses and actors who tested him, even when they exhausted him. He forgave a lot over the decades, but that single, blank page in someone else's memoir, the silence where an explanation should have been, was the one thing he apparently never fully let go of, a small, quiet wound tucked behind a career full of loud, unforgettable performances. What do you think about the story behind Ernest Borgnine's most painful relationship? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.